killer tried to remove all evidence of the crime, but in the process created entirely new forensic evidence that almost had investigators stumped. Until scientists tried a technique that had never been used in a criminal case, and in doing so, made forensic history. Farmersville, Texas is the epitome of small-town America. At one time, it was the onion capital of the state, a place where old-fashioned values endure.
We still have people who will actually tell me, we don't lock our doors, this is Farmersville.
20-year-old Rochelle Tollison was born here, grew up here, and it's where she chose to raise her 6-month-old daughter, Avery.
She was a happy person. She had her troubled times just like any other teenager does. She was a great mom. She was a very dedicated mom.
Rochelle was going through an unpleasant divorce and lived alone with her daughter close to the center of town. Around 7:30 in the morning on a warm spring day in 2004, Rochelle's mother stopped by to visit. Inside, she found Avery on the bed, alone, but she couldn't find Rochelle.
I started calling her name. She didn't answer. I started looking in the closets and under her bed, and I couldn't find her.
There were signs that something had happened. The bed was moved, and the headboard had fallen forward. A nightstand was pushed away from the wall. But Rochelle's purse and her car were still there. On the kitchen floor was a possible clue. It was Rochelle's divorce petition, and on it, a large shoe print as if someone had stomped on it.
Because it would indicate that someone other than Rochelle was in that home the night that she disappeared.
Rochelle's mother called her soon-to-be ex-son-in-law, Andrew Tollison, to brief him on the situation.
I said, Andrew, we can't find Rochelle. We can't find her anywhere. He said he couldn't leave work right now.
Police questioned as many of the town's residents as they could and organized a search party to look in every field and pasture.
The search was huge. There was just an immediate reaction all over the place. ATVs, four-wheel drive vehicles, horseback, on foot. It was a phenomenal response.
For 5 days, the search continued, with no trace of Rochelle anywhere.
I honestly believe that there was a lot of people that maybe didn't know Rochelle very well, that were thinking, oh, well, you know, she just ran off.
I know her. She just would never leave Avery. She wouldn't leave her alone for a second. I mean, that was her oxygen. She loved her so much.
Then, a man hiking on state land about 10 miles from Rochelle's home discovered the charred remains of a young female. Dental records confirmed the victim was Rochelle Tollison.
About 100 feet away from where the body was located, there was a pit, an open area, where they found several logs. They found an area that appeared to have been burned in.
I had spent many hours with her mother, and to have to go back and tell her, we found her body, but you can't see her. You can't identify your daughter. You can't touch her and tell her goodbye. That was hard.
I don't know, my heart just stopped. And I couldn't believe it. I needed proof. I don't know what else to say.
The investigation would be difficult. The killer burned Rochelle's body to destroy any evidence. But police certainly knew where to start, with Rochelle's estranged husband, Andrew Tollefson.
People do things they shouldn't do, and we suffer because of that.
Most of Farmersville, Texas turned out for Rochelle Tollefson's funeral service at the First Baptist Church. It was difficult for them to understand how Rochelle could have been abducted from her home in the middle of the night and no one heard it.
There are no strangers in Farmersville. Her house was 3 blocks from the police station, 2 blocks from the town square. I don't think the police believed that it was a stranger crime either. Clearly everybody felt that she knew whoever had taken her, that she knew them.
Generally speaking, in a small community, it is going to be someone within at least that person's social circle, even if they're not close friends, someone who knows the victim.
The autopsy revealed Rochelle had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled to death.
I was horrified. I'm also a mother and a grandmother. Just knowing that one human being could do that to another human being is horrifying.
The circumstances of this case were horrific. You had a young mother, a totally innocent victim, who is kidnapped in the middle of the night, is brutally raped, choked to death, and stabbed. And then her body is taken out to a remote location and disposed of just like trash.
To investigators, the one person with a possible motive was her estranged husband, Andrew, especially since the divorce wasn't his idea.
Rochelle just grew up a little faster than Andrew did in the time that they were together. And I think it just split them up. And I think Rochelle just realized, or felt like, I should say, that she wasn't going to get anywhere. And that it was time to move on.
Andrew had an alibi for the night of Rochelle's murder. He said he was at a party with friends. One of them drove him home later, and Andrew said he didn't leave his home again until the next morning to go to work.
He was heavily intoxicated during that night, and we had evidence that confirmed that he had been at his home the entire night because of his intoxication.
His alibi appeared to check out until investigators learned there was a bonfire at that party. This was an interesting coincidence since Rochelle's body had been burned in a fire pit. So Lieutenant Larry Smart wanted to know if there was any connection between the bonfire and the crime scene.
We collected those logs in order to have the forensic scientists look at them.
Lieutenant Smart sent the wood samples from the bonfire and the crime scene fire to Dr. Henry Gracino Mayer, an associate professor of geography at the University of Tennessee.
I wasn't too enthusiastic at first, and I probably came across as not very enthusiastic. So I wasn't overly excited.
By just looking at it, Dr. Gracino Mayer recognized that the wood from both locations was mesquite. The mesquite tree is extremely common in desert areas and often used to grill food. It burns slowly and produces very little smoke. But there really wasn't any way to tell whether both wood samples came from the same source. There were no distinctive saw marks, and the tree rings were virtually useless.
This is a type of wood where it has small vessels all throughout the ring, and it does not, therefore, have very distinct rings when you sand them down.
I was really let down. I felt like this was such good evidence for us.
But Dr. Gracino Mayer remembered something. A new test he had read about. A test that could identify the chemical fingerprint of the wood.
Laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy is actually very young. It hasn't been around for a while, but now it's used by the FBI, it's used in counterterrorism, and you'll learn all this from Dr. Martin. It is an incredible new tool.
He sent the wood to Dr. Madavi Martin at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
We just put the wood underneath the laser beam, excited a spark on the sample surface, all the elements, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and you will see it immediately.
The spark, known as a plasma cloud, contains all the chemical elements from the sample. A spectrometer identifies those elements. Most of the elements were typical, but one was not.
This one had titanium, which really jumped out at me. We saw consistently titanium across the whole spectra.
Titanium doesn't naturally occur in wood, and this suggested that the mesquite tree was growing near an industrial area where titanium polluted the groundwater. 11 logs were tested, 8 from the crime scene and 3 from the bonfire. All had the exact same chemical makeup and identical levels of titanium.
We were able to determine that the two sets of wood matched with about a 99.99% level of confidence. These two sets of wood came from the same population of trees, if not from the same tree.
This was a forensic first. Never before had two sets of wood in a criminal case been found to have the exact same chemical fingerprint.
99.9 is just mind-boggling. I was blown away by that. If they had come back and told us that they're 90% sure that the wood came from the same tree or vicinity, we would have been excited about that.
Since the wood at the bonfire was from the same tree as the wood used in Rochelle's cremation, this was a remarkable piece of circumstantial evidence, pointing to Andrew Tollison as the killer. Or was it? Rochelle Tollison was abducted from her home, apparently by someone she knew, and her burned body was found in a deserted state park. Rochelle's estranged husband, Andrew, was at a bonfire party the night Rochelle was abducted, and wood from the bonfire matched the wood used to burn Rochelle's body. A 99.9% certainty. This evidence was a possible link between Andrew Tollison and the scene of his life's murder.
Whenever someone turns up missing, particularly where there's a divorce involved, everyone's going to be a suspect involving the ex-husband in this case.
But that conclusion was premature. Partygoers told investigators that Andrew Tollison had nothing to do with the bonfire. It was someone else who brought the mesquite firewood to the party. It was 21-year-old Moises Mendoza, an air conditioning repairman, and an acquaintance of both Rochelle and Andrew.
They went to school together, and as a matter of fact, I even pulled out pictures of Rochelle's elementary, middle school, and as weird as it sounds, he was always in one of her classes.
When Rochelle and Andrew separated, friends said Mendoza expressed interest in dating her.
I think maybe Moses wanted to be a little closer friend to Rochelle than what Rochelle wanted to be with him.
There was no evidence that the two ever dated, but as acquaintances, they often saw one another at parties and social gatherings. All this seemed innocent enough until police looked into Mendoza's past.
Moises Mendoza had an extensive criminal background. He had committed 2 aggravated robberies where he had attempted to abduct young women in Dallas, had been unsuccessful.
Mendoza was out on bail for one of those crimes when Rochelle disappeared. A search of his home turned up a pair of boots. They were covered in soot and smelled of gasoline. To see whether these boots matched the print found in Rochelle's home, investigators sent them to forensic analyst Michael Villarreal. He made test impressions of the soles and then did a visual comparison with the partial print from Rochelle's house.
Once I noticed that there were similarities in the size, shape, and design, I did take a look for specific accidental characteristics and see if the accidental characteristics on the shoe were also present in the partial heel impression.
Accidental characteristics result from how a shoe is worn. They are unique to each set of shoes. In this case, the boot print on the divorce decree was remarkably clear, perfect for comparison. Cut marks in the heel of the boot left no doubt.
I was able to determine that the submitted shoes, in this case, did make that partial impression to the exclusion of all others.
What they found was this. It was an exact match.
Police also tested a pair of soot-covered jeans from Mendoza's house. Underneath the soot were tiny blood stains. The DNA profile of the blood matched Rochelle Tollison. Homicide investigators confronted Mendoza with the forensic evidence.
It was like he didn't care. He was detached from the whole situation, had no remorse, was a very cold person.
It didn't seem real. I woke up the next day and I was like, man, that seemed like a dream. But I was so scared, and I walked out to the back and I was like, man, this is real. I did it.
I'm convinced of this. In some people, there's a violent, evil streak that controls them. That streak was in Moises Mendoza. He wanted something that night. He was not going to have anyone say no to him.
On the night of the crime, prosecutors say Moises Mendoza went to the bonfire party and brought along some mesquite wood to burn. Witnesses said Mendoza was drinking and was angry.
He'd gotten crossways with several people at the party. He got crossways with 2 women at the party where he threatened to kill those women. He threatened to cut their heads off. He was making all sorts of threats.
When Mendoza saw Andrew Tollefson at the party alone, he knew that Rochelle would be at home alone. He left the party around 2 a.m., and the evidence suggests he drove to Rochelle's house. It's not clear what he said to get inside, but the evidence indicates there was a struggle. Rochelle's divorce petition fell to the floor, which Mendoza stepped on with his left boot. Clear proof he was there. Where he took Rochelle afterwards is unclear. DNA testing found Rochelle's blood on Mendoza's jeans. Later, he used some of the mesquite wood to start the fire in the deserted state park in an attempt to incinerate all evidence of the murder. While he may have gotten rid of some forensic evidence, he unwittingly created more, which provided an unmistakable forensic link between Mendoza and the crime scene.
Forensics could match it back to the same tree, not to the same grove or the same type of tree, but to the same tree. And those are the types of results we expect to see in DNA, not in trees or vegetables.
3 months after Rochelle's death, Moises Mendoza was tried and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death.
He actually chose the death penalty for himself when he decided that evening to go in that home and to take that young mother and to snuff out her life with absolutely no regard for her or her child or her family.
And I know it's probably not right to say this, but if it was up to me, he would have got a lot worse. And when I say a lot worse, I mean torture-wise, because I think that the death penalty is not, I think it's too good for him.
Rochelle's parents are now raising their granddaughter, Avery. And they're grateful that some enterprising detectives searched for a scientific solution they didn't know existed, and that those scientists pushed further instead of simply saying nothing could be done. The result made forensic history.
It's unbelievable the technology nowadays that they can do, and the forensic testing, it's unreal. And I think that it probably puts a lot of people's minds at ease knowing that they can do these types of things.
It's just phenomenal what they can do now, and I have tried to convince the younger detectives that they really need to stay in touch with the scientists and on all the new technology that's involved here, because that's going to be the future of law enforcement, is the forensics, if it's not already.